Long before civilization, climate repeatedly erased the worlds humans depended on. Lakes vanished, coastlines drowned, and entire regions became uninhabitable. Some populations escaped. Others disappeared without a trace. These are 10 prehistoric climate disasters that reveal how close human communities came to extinction and what allowed a few to survive. Number 10. The 8.2 Kiloyear Event. When the climate shock divided communities, around 8,200 years ago, the Northern Hemisphere was struck by one of the sharpest climate disruptions of the early Holocene. The last ice age had ended. Temperatures were generally warmer, forests were spreading, and human communities were settling into seasonal environments that appeared increasingly stable. Then a vast volume of cold freshwater poured into the North Atlantic. It came from enormous glacial lakes left behind by the retreating North American ice sheets. When that freshwater spread across the ocean surface, it disrupted the circulation that carried heat northward. Temperatures fell across parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Rainfall patterns shifted. Some regions became colder, others became much drier. The most intense phase may have lasted only a few generations, but that was long enough to destabilize the ecosystems on which small communities depended. At archaeological sites in western Scotland, evidence of Mesolithic activity declined around the time of the event. A similar pattern appears in the central Ebro basin of northeastern Spain. Places that had been visited repeatedly became less active or were abandoned. The simplest explanation seems obvious. The climate changed, resources failed, people disappeared. But archaeology rarely gives such a clean answer. Not every settlement ended. Not every region experienced the same decline. Some communities continued living in familiar territories. Others changed how they gathered food or moved toward rivers, wetlands, coastlines, and landscapes with a broader range of resources. That difference reveals something important. The danger of a climate shock does not depend only on how much the temperature changes. It also depends on how vulnerable a community already is. A small group that relies heavily on one seasonal food source can be devastated by a few unusually cold or dry decades. Another group with access to fish, shellfish, game, edible plants, and exchange partners may survive the same event with far less disruption. Even an abandoned campsite can be misleading. Its inhabitants may not have died there. They may have joined relatives in another valley, moved closer to the coast, or broken into smaller traveling groups that left fewer traces. The 8.2 Kiloyear event did not bring humanity close to extinction. Its importance lies elsewhere. It separated communities that could reorganize from those that could no longer maintain their former way of life. And that same pattern appears again and again throughout prehistory. Yet the people affected by this event could still retreat across solid ground. The next populations watched the ground itself disappear beneath the sea. Number 9. The fluting of Sundaland, the continent that disappeared beneath the sea. Today, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula are separated by broad stretches of shallow water. During the coldest phase of the last ice age, much of that water was absent. So much of the planet's water had been trapped inside continental ice sheets that global sea level stood more than 100 meters below its modern position. The exposed land joined the islands of western Indonesia to mainland Southeast Asia. Scientists call this lost region Sundaland. It was far more than a narrow land bridge. Sundaland contained forests, river valleys, wetlands, open plains, and coastlines extending far beyond those seen today. People and animals could cross landscapes, now divided by hundreds of kilometers of sea. Ancient rivers flowed across the continental shelf and joined drainage systems that no longer exist. Then the great ice sheets began to melt. The oceans rose. There was no single day when Sundaland disappeared. The flooding unfolded over thousands of years. Coastlines moved inland. River valleys became estuaries. Low plains turned into marshes and shallow bays. A place used by one generation could be underwater by the time its descendants returned. At several points, the rise accelerated. During major meltwater pulses, enormous quantities of glacial water entered the oceans within relatively short periods. The greatest losses were not always the most dramatic mountains or forests. They were the lowlands. River valleys and coastal plains often provide the richest concentration of food. They contain fish, shellfish, birds, edible plants, freshwater, and predictable routes used by large animals. As those environments disappeared, communities were pushed toward higher ground. The remaining land became more crowded. Groups that had once moved through continuous forests and plains found themselves separated by widening channels. Hills became islands. Old travel routes vanished beneath the water. Genetic studies of present-day populations have been compared with reconstructions of Sundaland's ancient geography. Some estimated population separations appear close in time to major phases of flooding. That does not allow researchers to trace every migration or identify exactly which community moved where, but it supports a broader conclusion. The drowning of Sundaland reshaped human movement and isolation across Southeast Asia. Populations may have moved toward the mainland, onto surviving islands, or farther east. At the same time, communities that had once exchanged materials, knowledge, and marriage partners were divided. Isolation can become dangerous very quickly. When a large population is broken into smaller groups, each community becomes more vulnerable to local failure. A few years of low birth rates, disease, conflict, or food shortage can have a far greater effect on a group containing only a few hundred people. Yet separation can also create diversity. Communities isolated on different islands may develop distinct technologies, customs, and genetic histories. The destruction of one connected human landscape can create several new populations. Sundaland was therefore a catastrophe without a single moment of destruction. People had time to escape, but over many generations, their entire homeland was erased. The population survived. Their world did not. And while Sundaland vanished because the water advanced, another enormous homeland was transformed because the water disappeared. Number 8. The end of the African humid period. When the green Sahara died, the Sahara now appears almost timeless. Its dunes, stone plateaus, and dry basins stretch across northern Africa on a scale difficult to imagine. But beneath the sand lie ancient shorelines. Across desert rock faces are images of cattle, wildlife, hunters, and people swimming. These scenes were not fantasies. They preserve the memory of a Sahara filled with lakes, rivers, wetlands, and grasslands. During the African humid period, stronger monsoon systems carried rainfall deep into regions that are now desert. Vegetation spread across the landscape. Animals moved through areas that could support hunters, fishers, and later pastoral communities with domesticated cattle. For thousands of years, the Green Sahara connected parts of Africa, now divided by extreme aridity. Then Earth's orbital conditions continued to shift. Northern Hemisphere summers received less sunlight. The monsoon weakened and moved southward. Rainfall became less reliable. The transition did not unfold at the same speed everywhere. Some lake records suggest rapid changes. Others show a decline that lasted for centuries. Environmental evidence from places such as the Chu-Bahir Basin records a long movement toward aridity, broken by repeated droughts. That slow pace created a different kind of danger. When a lake vanishes in a single season, everyone understands that a crisis has arrived. But when the shoreline retreats a little during every generation, no one witnesses the entire collapse. Each generation inherits a landscape slightly poorer than the one before. A grazing route becomes less dependable. A seasonal waterhole fails more often. Herds must travel farther. A settlement that once supported many families can sustain only a few. Eventually, communities face choices their ancestors never had to make. Some move toward the remaining lakes. Others follow the Nile or travel south toward the Sahel. Pastoral groups become more mobile, moving people and livestock between scattered sources of water. Other populations disappear from places where their camps and traditions had once been common. The Sahara's inhabitants were not simply exterminated, they were redistributed. That distinction matters. Climate disasters often change where people live more clearly than they change the total number of people alive. As communities concentrated around rivers and wetlands, patterns of contact changed. Groups that had once lived far apart began meeting more often. Livestock, tools, customs, and ideas moved with them. The growing importance of the Nile Valley may have been influenced by this long regional drying, although climate alone cannot explain the societies that later developed there. Meanwhile, the center of the Sahara emptied. Only rock art, abandoned camps, ancient shorelines, and dried sediments remained. The Green Sahara did not die in one spectacular event. It faded over generations. The people living there withdrew step by step as the region crossed one ecological threshold after another. They had time to respond. The next populations were given far less warning. After the Ice Age seemed to be ending, the cold suddenly returned. Number 7. The Younger Dryas. The sudden return of the ice. Around 14,700 years ago, temperatures across much of the northern hemisphere began rising rapidly. Ice sheets retreated. Forests moved north. Animals expanded into newly available habitats, and human communities followed. Then, roughly 12,900 years ago, the warming stopped. Across the North Atlantic region, temperatures fell sharply. Cold conditions returned and remained for more than 1,000 years. This interval is known as the Younger Dryas. Changes in fresh water entering the Atlantic and disruptions to ocean circulation played a central role, although the exact sequence is still being studied. For people living in Europe, the ecological consequences were severe. Forests retreated in some regions. Open tundra and cold grasslands expanded. Plant productivity changed. Prey animals altered their ranges and migration routes. Mobile hunter-gatherers depended on knowledge passed down through generations. They needed to know where herds would cross a valley, when plants would appear, which rivers froze in winter, and where shelter could be found. A sudden climate reversal made parts of that inherited knowledge unreliable. Archaeological evidence from several areas of Europe suggests declining populations, regional abandonment, or settlement contraction during the cold phase. The number of known sites falls across some northern and western regions. Radiocarbon-based models suggest that population growth ended or reversed in parts of the Iberian Peninsula. Other areas, particularly farther east, may have received migrants, as communities moved away from deteriorating western and northern environments. The disappearance of archaeological sites does not mean everyone died. In many cases, it probably records retreat. When northern territories could no longer support earlier settlement levels, people moved toward refuges. These might be river valleys, coastlines, southern peninsulas, or areas where mountains and lowlands created several food zones within a limited distance. Those who remained had to adjust. They could change prey, travel farther, reduce group size, or reorganize seasonal gatherings. But every adjustment came at a cost. Smaller, more scattered communities had fewer opportunities to exchange information or find unrelated partners. One failed hunt or severe winter became more dangerous. Specialized knowledge could vanish if the few people who possessed it died before passing it on. Climate-driven fragmentation can therefore weaken a population without causing immediate mass death. Culture itself depends on enough people remaining connected to preserve it. The Younger Dryas showed how quickly territory that seemed newly available could be lost again. As the climate contracted, human geography contracted with it. But this was still primarily a climate event. The next disaster began at one of the largest volcanic eruptions experienced by Homo sapiens. For decades, it was described as the catastrophe that almost ended humanity. Then archaeologists looked more closely. Number 6. The Toba super-eruption. The eruption that was supposed to end humanity. Around 74,000 years ago, a colossal eruption tore through Toba in what is now Sumatra. The event expelled enormous quantities of ash and volcanic material. Its collapsed caldera became one of the largest volcanic structures on Earth. Ash spread across South Asia and the Indian Ocean. Microscopic traces have been found at archaeological sites thousands of kilometers away. An eruption of this scale seemed capable of changing the global climate. Volcanic sulfur released high into the atmosphere can reflect sunlight and cool the surface. Reduced sunlight can shorten growing seasons and weaken entire food webs. For small prehistoric communities, even a few years of lower ecological productivity could be devastating. Toba soon became connected to a dramatic hypothesis. Perhaps the eruption created a volcanic winter. Perhaps human populations collapsed. Perhaps Homo sapiens survived only inside a few isolated refuges. The relatively low genetic diversity of living humans was sometimes presented as the lasting mark of this catastrophe. It was a compelling explanation. One eruption appeared to solve a major mystery in human evolution. But a compelling story still has to survive the evidence. If Toba nearly destroyed Homo sapiens, archaeological sites affected by the eruption should show major disruption. Human activity should decline. Technologies might disappear. Regions might be abandoned. At several important sites, that is not what researchers found. On the southern coast of Africa, microscopic Toba ash occurs within archaeological layers containing evidence of continued human occupation. There is no simple break. At some locations, activity may even have intensified after the eruption. Coastal ecosystems may have helped. Shellfish, fish, edible plants, and land animals provided several possible sources of food. Communities were not dependent on a single resource that could fail all at once. In central India, stone tools have been found both below and above deposits associated with the Toba eruption. The technology continues across the event, rather than disappearing. That does not mean local people experienced no hardship. It does mean the region was not simply emptied. At Shinfa Metima in Ethiopia, evidence from near the same period reveals another kind of resilience. The environment was highly seasonal. As rivers and waterholes shrank during dry periods, fish became trapped in smaller pools. People exploited those temporary concentrations while continuing to use other animal and plant resources. They did not survive by resisting environmental change. They survived by switching strategies. That may be one of the deepest patterns in human history. When one resource fails, can another take its place? When one area becomes unproductive, can the community move? When familiar prey disappear, can people recognize and process something new? Toba almost certainly affected climate and ecosystems. Its consequences were probably far more serious near the eruption than at distant sites. Some communities may have declined or vanished, without leaving evidence that has yet been found. But the record does not support the claim that the eruption nearly exterminated Homo sapiens as a species. Instead, Toba became a lesson in scientific revision. Researchers went looking for the traces of a global population collapse. They found continuity, local adaptation, and communities more resilient than expected. Yet resilience is never unlimited. A single eruption may not explain why a human population disappears. But what if volcanic damage overlaps with severe cold, shrinking habitat, demographic isolation, and the arrival of another human population? That question leads to the final age of the Neanderthals. Number 5. Heinrich Stadial IV and the Campanian ignimbrite. The double disaster at the end of the Neanderthals. Around 40,000 years ago, Europe was home to at least two forms of humanity. Neanderthals had lived across Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Homo sapiens was now entering many of the same regions. Their contact unfolded during a period of intense environmental instability. A major cold interval, known as Heinrich Stadial 4, affected the North Atlantic and surrounding continents. Temperatures and rainfall patterns shifted. Parts of Europe became colder, drier, and less productive. Then Campi Flegrei in southern Italy produced the Campanian ignimbrite eruption. Ash and volcanic materials spread across a huge area. Landscapes near the volcano were devastated. Farther away, ash could contaminate vegetation, water, and grazing land. The timing appeared almost too perfect. A severe climate downturn. A major eruption. The final millennia of Neanderthal existence. It was tempting to connect them into a single explanation. Perhaps the cold weakened the Neanderthals. Perhaps the eruption destroyed what remained of their habitat. Perhaps Homo sapiens simply occupied the empty territory. The evidence refuses to remain that simple. Neanderthal populations were already small and fragmented. Different regions experienced the climatic downturn in different ways. Some habitats shrank dramatically. Others remained relatively stable. Volcanic ash was also distributed unevenly. Communities far from Italy did not all face the same level of damage. Some archaeological sequences continue through the eruption. Others end before it. And Neanderthals did not disappear everywhere at exactly the same moment. Climate may still have been decisive, but not by killing Neanderthals directly. When forests shrink, prey communities change. When open grasslands spread, established hunting strategies may become less effective. When suitable habitats break into isolated patches, human groups lose contact. A community of a few dozen people may continue for generations. Long-term isolation, however, creates risks that slowly accumulate. Too few births can begin a decline. A lack of unrelated partners can reduce genetic diversity. The death of one experienced toolmaker, healer, hunter, or elder can remove knowledge no one else possesses. Then Homo sapiens entered this unstable system. The interaction was not simply a war between two species. Genetic evidence shows that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred. Some Neanderthals were absorbed into expanding Homo sapiens populations rather than completely replaced. But Homo sapiens may have maintained broader social networks. Materials moved across longer distances. Information traveled between groups. Partners could be found beyond the nearest valley. Even a modest advantage in connectivity can become decisive during repeated crises. Imagine two populations living in a deteriorating landscape. Both hunt effectively. Both make sophisticated tools. Both use fire and shelter. One population, however, can draw upon relationships hundreds of kilometers away. It receives news of distant resources. It can obtain materials through exchange. Young adults can join other communities. The second population is divided into smaller, more isolated groups. The climate does not need to kill them directly. It only needs to make recovery less likely after each local failure. The Campanian ignimbrite did not single-handedly exterminate the Neanderthals. Heinrich Stadial 4 cannot explain their disappearance on its own. And Homo sapiens did not arrive as an unstoppable invading force. The ending was probably created by several pressures interacting over thousands of years. Environmental instability rearranged habitats. Small populations became increasingly fragmented. Contact with Homo sapiens changed access to territory, networks, and potential partners. Some Neanderthals died without descendants. Others became part of the populations that followed. They disappeared as a distinct form of humanity, but they were not erased. Their DNA survives in many people today. The Neanderthal story changes the central question. Perhaps survival depended less on being stronger than another human population and more on being able to live in a wider range of places. That possibility becomes clearer during one of the most important environmental transitions in Homo sapiens history. Number 4. Marine isotope stage 4. The ecological squeeze. Marine isotope stage 4 lasted from roughly 71,000 to 57,000 years ago. It was not a sudden catastrophe. It was a prolonged interval of colder global temperatures, expanding ice, lower sea levels, and major regional changes in rainfall. Across Africa, its effects varied. Some environments became drier. Seasonal patterns changed. Habitats shifted, contracted, or disappeared. Earlier interpretations of human evolution suggested that these conditions may have forced Homo sapiens into a few favorable refuges. Some populations almost certainly were reduced or isolated, but large archaeological datasets reveal something else as well. Around this broad period, humans began appearing across a wider range of environments. There is evidence of occupation in deserts, tropical forests, high elevations, interior grasslands, coastal zones, wetlands, and strongly seasonal landscapes. Not every environment was occupied continuously, nor did every population possess the same abilities. What changed was the overall ecological range of the species. Homo sapiens was becoming less dependent on one type of habitat. That shift may have been more important than any single invention. Many animals succeed through specialization. They become perfectly adapted to a narrow ecological niche, but specialization carries a risk. When the habitat disappears, the specialist may have nowhere else to go. Humans increasingly relied on behavior instead. Clothing could be altered. Shelters could be rebuilt. Tools could be redesigned. Food could be processed in new ways. Fire transformed diet and living space. Knowledge could move between communities. During marine isotope stage 4, those abilities may have allowed populations to respond to environmental pressure by widening their options. A community living near a seasonal river could exploit fish when the water level dropped. Coastal groups could combine shellfish with hunting on land. People living in dry interiors could plan movement between temporary water sources. Forest communities developed knowledge of plants and animals that outsiders might never recognize as food. The advantage was not that every person knew how to survive everywhere. No prehistoric community possessed complete knowledge of every environment. Different populations understood different places. Connection allowed techniques, materials, and genes to move between them. That diversity could function as a survival system. When one region failed, another remained productive. When one method became unreliable, another population might already possess an alternative. When separated groups met again, the knowledge they carried could be combined. The difficult conditions of marine isotope stage 4 did not simply push Homo sapiens toward extinction. They may also have rewarded the flexibility that later allowed humans to expand far beyond Africa. But that flexibility had deeper roots. Some of them may lie in earlier African climate crises, when enormous lakes shrank and human communities were divided into ecological islands. Number 3. The East African megadroughts. When Africa's Great Lakes nearly vanished. Lake Malawi stretches for hundreds of kilometers through eastern Africa. Its waters support one of the richest freshwater ecosystems on the planet. Far below the surface, layers of sediment preserve a climate history extending deep into the past. When scientists drilled into those sediments, they found evidence of droughts far more severe than anything experienced in recent history. Between roughly 135,000 and 75,000 years ago, parts of tropical Africa endured repeated periods of extreme aridity. At the height of the crisis, the volume of Lake Malawi may have fallen by at least 95%. The shoreline retreated dramatically. Areas now covered by deep water became exposed ground. Vegetation around the lake shifted toward dry, open conditions. Comparable evidence from other African lakes suggests these were not minor local fluctuations. Large regions experienced serious hydrological stress. For human communities, the danger extended far beyond thirst. Lakes and rivers organize entire ecosystems. They provide fish, plants, fresh water, and raw materials. They attract animals and create predictable routes through the landscape. They also bring human groups into contact. When a lake collapses, every part of that system changes. People living near Lake Malawi may have moved toward highlands, surviving wetlands, coastal environments, or other refuges. As productive areas shrank, populations may have become concentrated within a small number of favorable zones. Groups once connected across wide territories could be separated by expanding drylands. That process is known as population fragmentation. Its dangers are clear. A large population becomes several smaller ones. Each group has fewer partners, fewer specialists, and less protection against a local disaster. But fragmentation can also produce diversity. Separated communities encounter different environments. They develop different hunting methods, tools, seasonal routes, and social relationships. Some disappear. Others survive in isolation. When wetter conditions return, the survivors may expand and meet again. Those encounters can involve competition, exchange, migration, and interbreeding. Human evolution in Africa was probably not a simple story in which one small population suddenly became modern and spread across the world. It increasingly appears to have involved many populations scattered across the continent. Climate repeatedly separated and reconnected them. Megadroughts could close the corridors between communities. Wetter periods could open them again. In this model, the environment kept rearranging the population network from which Homo sapiens emerged. But the evidence has limits. Lake sediments record the droughts clearly. They do not count the people who lived nearby. A dry layer cannot, by itself, prove that the human population passed through a genetic bottleneck. Archaeological evidence from the relevant periods remains uneven. Some possible refuges are difficult to investigate. Others may lie beneath modern lakes, forests, deserts, or coastlines. The safest conclusion is also the most revealing. The megadroughts created conditions capable of reducing, isolating, and redirecting human populations. They changed where people could live and how communities could remain connected. How many people were lost is still unknown. That uncertainty exposes one of the hardest problems in deep prehistory. Climate records can be continuous. Human records are not. The lake preserves every drought. The people who experienced it may have left only a handful of tools. Those tools suggest that refuges repeatedly kept small populations alive. During the last ice age, the same process became visible in far greater detail. Ancient DNA now shows which European populations entered those refuges, which emerged again, and which never returned. Number 2. The Last Glacial Maximum. The ice age that emptied Europe. Between roughly 26,500 and 19,000 years ago, the great ice sheets reached their maximum extent during the last glacial period. Northern Europe was transformed. Ice covered Britain, Scandinavia, and neighboring regions. Farther south, permafrost, tundra, cold grasslands, and harsh seasonal conditions spread across the continent. Sea levels fell, exposing coastlines that now lie beneath the water. Many northern territories became completely uninhabitable, or could support only brief visits by small groups. Human populations contracted toward the south. The Iberian Peninsula became one of the most important refuges. Parts of southwestern Europe retained environments where people, animals, and plants could survive through the coldest millennia. Other refuges existed in the Balkans, near the Black Sea, and within parts of Italy. But survival did not unfold in the same way inside each of them. For decades, archaeologists reconstructed these movements from tools, ornaments, and cave art. Ancient DNA changed the picture. Genetic evidence shows that some Western European populations survived the last glacial maximum and later expanded. Continuity, however, was not universal. In parts of southern Europe, earlier ancestry was replaced or heavily transformed. Groups using broadly similar archaeological traditions were not always closely related. That distinction matters. A tool style can spread without an entire population moving. People can adopt another community's technology. Two genetically different groups can make objects archaeologists classify within the same tradition. Ancient DNA therefore reveals population losses that tools alone may conceal. Some lineages survived inside refuges. Some were absorbed. Some were replaced. Others vanished. Population models suggest that the total number of people living in Europe fell substantially during the coldest phase. The exact figures are estimates, not a census. But the direction is clear. As the habitable zone contracted, the population contracted with it. Survival demanded more than tolerance of low temperatures. People needed fuel. They required clothing made from animal skins and shelters capable of retaining heat. They needed reliable access to migrating animals or other concentrated foods. Above all, they needed social relationships beyond the immediate camp. A community could survive a failed hunting season if allies shared food or information. It could obtain missing materials through exchange. Young adults could find partners in neighboring groups and prevent dangerous isolation. Refuges were therefore not simply warm places. They were social landscapes. A peninsula containing several connected valleys could preserve a stronger network than an isolated pocket with the same climate. When conditions improved, the surviving populations expanded. Europe was not repopulated by one unified group moving north. Different populations emerged from different refuges. They met, mixed, competed, and sometimes replaced one another. The post-glacial map was created by the unequal survival of earlier communities. The last glacial maximum came close to ending particular European ancestries, even though humans remained secure elsewhere. It emptied vast territories and compressed the continent's population into a handful of demographic strongholds. Yet those survivors possessed tens of thousands of years of accumulated culture. They tailored clothing, built shelters, created art, maintained long-distance networks, used highly developed toolkits. Their societies carried solutions forged through many earlier climate cycles. More than 1 million years before them, Europe's first human inhabitants may have had far fewer protections. Then they encountered a cold event, unlike anything they had previously faced. The result may have been the disappearance of humans from an entire continent. Number 1. The First Great Ice Age Crisis. The climate disaster that may have reset human history. The first human occupation of Europe is still being reconstructed. Stone tools and fossils from several sites show that people reached the continent more than 1 million years ago. Some evidence places humans in the wider European region by about 1.4 million years ago. These early populations probably moved from Western Asia into Southern Europe during favorable climate intervals. The Mediterranean world they entered was not permanently warm, but it offered animals, plants, fresh water, and raw materials. These people made stone tools. They may have controlled fire in at least some settings, although regular fire use during Europe's earliest occupation remains uncertain. Their populations were small. Their clothing and shelters were unlikely to match those developed by humans much later in the Ice Age. Their ability to survive long, severe winters may have been limited. For years, researchers assumed that once humans entered Europe, they remained through the climate cycles that followed. Then marine sediments recovered off the coast of Portugal revealed evidence of extreme cooling around 1.15 million years ago. Ocean temperatures fell. Conditions around the Mediterranean became colder and drier. Environmental models suggest biological productivity declined across regions occupied by early humans. The crisis may have lasted long enough to make much of Europe unsuitable. This was not simply another ordinary glacial period. Researchers have described the cooling as unusually severe for that stage of the early Pleistocene. For a small population, without advanced cold weather technology, the consequences may have been overwhelming. Edible plants became rarer or more seasonal. Animal populations moved south or declined. Winters lengthened. Fuel and shelter became critical. Infant mortality may have risen. As productive habitats contracted, communities became separated. Then the archaeological signal appears to weaken dramatically. For a long interval, evidence of human presence becomes extremely scarce or disappears. Humans later returned to Europe. They may not have been direct descendants of the first occupants surviving locally. The continent may have been abandoned and recolonized. If that interpretation is correct, this was one of the earliest known cases of climate, removing human populations from an entire continent. But another mystery appears several 100,000 years later. In 2023, researchers using a genetic model called FitCol proposed that the ancestors of later human populations experienced an extreme bottleneck between roughly 930,000 and 813,000 years ago. Their model estimated an effective population size of about 1,280 breeding individuals at the lowest point. The result produced dramatic headlines. Human ancestors had nearly gone extinct. Only around 1,000 individuals had survived. The reality is more complicated. Effective population size is not the same as the total number of people alive. It is a genetic measure shaped by reproduction, variation in family size, population structure, and patterns of ancestry across long periods. A population containing many thousands of actual individuals can produce a much smaller effective population estimate. The bottleneck itself is also disputed. Later analyses asked whether such an extreme decline was truly required to explain the genetic data. Some found that models without a severe bottleneck fit the evidence as well as, or better than, the original model. Population structure can imitate the genetic signature of collapse. Imagine many small communities spread across Africa and Eurasia. If contact between them decreases, their combined genetic record may resemble a sharp population decline, even if the total number of people never fell to the level suggested by a simpler model. This is where two separate discoveries can easily be forced into one dramatic story. The extreme European cooling occurred around 1.1 million years ago. The proposed genetic bottleneck begins later. Both are genuine subjects of research, but they cannot simply be joined together. The dates do not align perfectly. The populations may not have been the same. One event concerns the possible loss of people from Europe. The other is inferred from the genetic variation of living humans. A direct connection remains unproven. So what can the evidence support? Early human populations were small and vulnerable. Climate could make an entire region unsuitable for occupation. Europe may have lost its first human inhabitants during a period of extreme cold. Human population structure changed profoundly during the Middle Pleistocene, and the claim that all later human ancestors were reduced to roughly 1,280 breeding individuals remains unresolved. The greatest discovery here is not a confirmed near extinction. It is the depth of the uncertainty. A continent can empty and leave only a gap between archaeological sites. A population can fragment and produce a genetic pattern resembling collapse. A human lineage can disappear without leaving fossils that have yet been recognized. Europe's first inhabitants may have retreated south or east. They may have merged with other populations, or they may have died without leaving descendants. We still do not know. And if an entire European population could disappear more than 1 million years ago, how many others vanished in Africa, Asia, or along coastlines now beneath the sea? The disasters in this documentary took many forms. One flooded a continental shelf. Another dried a green Sahara. One returned Europe to near glacial cold. Another covered distant landscapes in volcanic ash. Several shrank lakes, broke migration corridors, or compressed populations into isolated refuges. Yet the same survival patterns appear throughout them. The first is movement. Humans survived because they did not always remain where the environment was failing. They followed water. moved toward coasts, retreated into peninsulas, crossed mountain passes, entered forests, deserts, wetlands, and highlands. Migration was not a failure to adapt. Migration was adaptation. The second pattern is flexibility. A population relying on one food source was vulnerable when that resource disappeared. Communities able to switch between hunting, fishing, gathering, scavenging, and plant processing had more options. Technology widened those options. Fire changed food. Clothing expanded the climates people could tolerate. Tools opened carcasses and processed plants. Cordage, containers, and shelters changed how resources could be collected, moved, and stored. The third pattern is refuge. A refuge did not need to be a warm paradise. It could be a river valley, a coastline, a lake margin, a mountain basin, or a southern peninsula. What mattered was relative stability. During regional collapse, a small area with dependable water and several food sources could preserve a population for thousands of years. The fourth pattern is connection. No community possessed every solution. Human survival depended on information moving between groups. Where to find water, which plants were safe, how to prepare an unfamiliar animal, where stone could be obtained, when herds would arrive, who could exchange food, where young adults might find partners. Climate shocks often became demographic disasters when those networks broke apart. The final pattern is unequal survival. It is tempting to imagine humanity as one prehistoric population facing each crisis together. It never was. People lived in many communities across very different environments. One population could flourish while another declined. One could migrate while another became trapped. One could preserve its ancestry while another was absorbed. Some survived without retaining a separate genetic identity. Others disappeared so completely that science has not yet recognized them. Modern humans are not descended from one invincible population that defeated every climate disaster. We are descended from the accumulated survivors of many separate crises. From people who moved before the last water disappeared. From communities that found fish when hunting failed. From families that crossed into unfamiliar territory. From isolated groups that eventually reconnected. From populations that mixed with other forms of humanity. And from those who reached a refuge with just enough food, knowledge, and support to produce another generation. The populations that survived left descendants. Those that vanished often left only silence. But the silence is not empty. It lies beneath desert sediment, inside drowned river valleys, between layers of volcanic ash, within gaps in ancient DNA, and across archaeological landscapes that have not yet been discovered. Somewhere beneath a submerged coastline, a dry lake bed, or an unexplored cave, the evidence of another lost human population may still be waiting.